Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chinida Koja-Amoji, and I'm a faculty member at the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding here at Georgetown University. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Mirjam Künkler, who will speak about her recently co-edited book, Female Religious Authority in Shi'a Islam, Past and Present. Professor Künkler is a research professor at the Institute for Advanced Legal Studies at the University of London. In addition to the book that we will discuss today, she has authored Democracy and Islam in Indonesia, A Secular Age Beyond the West, and she has a forthcoming edited volume on the rule of law in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Professor Künkler will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to have a conversation with her as well. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so very much for the very kind invitation. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here and to be invited by you, who has done such wonderful work on Ismaili women and Ismaili religious education. Yes, let me maybe start by telling the audience a little bit about how I came to this topic of women as religious authorities. And I was many years ago preparing a class on the Quran for my students and was flipping through the short introduction on the Quran authored by Michael Cook. And he mentions very briefly at some point that there's one tafsir, one Quranic commentary, an entire tafsir authored by a woman, Nosrat Amin of Iran. And I paused. I had worked on Iran for a number of years, done my field research there, and I had perhaps seen references to her, but had not really realized that she had authored an entire tafsir. And so I looked into the Princeton University library catalog, and lo and behold, the tafsir was actually there. I went into the library to consult it, and what was quite wonderful is that there are several editions of this tafsir. She started to publish the first volume in 1953, and then she finished it really in the late 70s because it's a 15-volume work. And the library had several editions. There, 3 have been published or had been published until that time, the late 2000s. And I was on the one hand ecstatic to have found it, but I was also struck looking through the documentation on how often it had been checked out. I assume there's probably a branch of knowledge of this tafsir, and quite a few people must have read it and consulted it and published something about it. And I realized that out of the 3 editions, 2 had never been checked out. And with the 3rd edition, only the first of the 15 volumes had ever been taken out of the library. So 14 volumes had never, of all editions, been taken out, and volume 1 of the latest edition had once been consulted. And that was, I think, in the early 90s or so. So it had already been quite some time until when I laid my hands on that book again. And that really got me to think about why it is that there apparently is, there was this one individual who was so outstanding to author an entire tafsir, and that role was really not acknowledged widely in the literature at all. And that led me to write an article with my colleague Ruja Fazaili, and that chapter here is reprinted in the volume that I will speak about today, on Nosrat Amin, and we compare her to a contemporary mujtahida in Iran, Zuhre Sefati. And then I later was on a dissertation committee of somebody called Mariam Rutner, who did her PhD at NYU, who then actually did her entire PhD on Nosrat Amin. Of course, that was wonderful to see that finally there had been one dissertation really dedicated to this lady and her works. And since then, also in Iran, there have been a number of MA theses that have consulted her, and sometimes focusing more on her work, sometimes more on her life. I will speak a little bit about her today as well. And that then led me to look into sort of the role of women as muftis more generally, whether women are allowed to serve as qadis, as judges of Islamic law, and to edit this book with Devin Stewart based on a conference where I brought together a number of scholars who had worked on individual women in the Twelver Shi'i tradition, who had been influential in either the generation of Islamic knowledge or in maybe issuing fatwas or in being bearers of religious authority in another way, for example, as a wakil, as a representative of a marja. And I hope to be able to say a little more about these examples in the coming minutes. Now, although the history of Islam attests to numerous examples of women transmitting hadith, so sayings of the Prophet, writing authoritative scholarly commentaries on the Quran and religious law, and issuing fatwas, women are rarely found in these roles today. Most Muslim countries do not allow women to serve as judges in Islamic courts, and few congregations would invite women to lead mixed gender prayers, or to deliver the sermon, or to turn to women's advice on matters of Islamic law. In the face of the dearth of women exercising Islamic authority, one might be forgiven for assuming that this must have been the case always, that for most of Islamic history, women had no business in gaining expertise on questions of religious law, and that these realms of knowledge were in the near exclusive domain of men. Yet, a look into Islamic history suggests otherwise. In the early periods of Islam, women had great prominence in transmitting the hadith, and the female family members of the Prophet were frequently consulted on questions of Islamic guidance. This practice did not remain limited to the Prophet's family or his descendants. As Khalid Abu al-Fadl notes, and this is from an entry in the Encyclopedia of Women in Islamic Societies, the one that's edited by Stewart Joseph, he writes, quote, certain families from Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad made a virtual tradition of training female transmitters and narrators, made a tradition of training female transmitters and narrators. And these female scholars regularly trained and certified not only female jurists, but also male jurists. And therefore, they played a major contributing role in the preservation and transmission of Islamic traditions, end of quote. And his entry is really wonderful. I recommend everyone to consult it because he gives really a long row of names and examples of women who were from scholarly families in these major centers of learning, Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, and where, as far as the sources allow, they really call for further research on their exact contribution to the history of Islamic knowledge creation and preservation. In his overview of the history of women as hadith scholars, al-Muhadithat, the Oxford scholar Muhammad Akram Nadvi observes that, quote, in the formative period of Islam, women scholars are not only great in number, but also great in prominence and great in their authority. Men go to them to learn, and doing so is normal. Doing so is normal. Now, in our volume, Female Religious Authority in Shi'i Islam, Devin, Stewart, and I have collected 11 case studies of women in the Twelver Shi'i tradition who have functioned as religious authorities. Chapters highlight the role of Fatima's sayings in later justifications of Islamic legal reasoning, the activities of Safavid princesses in creating institutions of women's religious learning, the role of Bint al-Huda in functioning as a wakil for her brother in the Iraq of the 1960s and 70s, examples of women religious leaders from 19th and 20th century Iran, and chapters on women's religious seminaries in Syria and Iran in the 2000s. Now, in the following, I will concentrate on 4 areas. First, what do the madhahib actually say regarding women's religious authority? Second, I will highlight the case of Nosrat Amin, the leading mujtahida of 20th century Iran. Third, I will provide an overview of the volume. And fourth, close with comparative observations that emanate from the case studies and calls for future research. So what do the jurists actually say about women in roles of religious authority? We can, of course, break down Islamic authority into a number of modes. We can think of leading prayer, delivering a khutbah, transmitting hadith, writing a tafsir, as I spoke about a moment ago, issuing ijazas, so certifying that the student has acquired certain levels of knowledge in specific branches of Islamic knowledge, issuing fatwas, and we would refer to someone who does so as a mufti, issuing legal rulings, such as qadis or judges do in court. And one can also think of less direct involvement, such as endowing institutions of religious learning, being responsible for designing curricula, for appointing learning personnel, teaching personnel, and also commissioning treatises, and you find examples of all of these in the volume. Now, what do the madhahib say about women's permissibility to act in some of these roles? Now, in the chapter, and I understand students have read several of the book's chapters, and in chapter 2, I summarize the literature on the very, very well-documented role that women played as hadith transmitters. And that's probably the branch of knowledge in which their role has been most intensively researched and cataloged based on bibliographic dictionaries. We can think of the work of Ruth Rodet, also Devin Stewart, Asma Said, who have worked very intensively on this, together also with a number of other works, for example, by Muhammad Akram Nadwi, also Irene Schneider, who have written about the extent to which influential Islamic scholars refer to women as their teachers. And I also give quite some details in that chapter. In this realm of knowledge, I don't talk so much about it in this talk here because they are mostly from the Sunni traditions, but I just want to sort of map it out that women's roles as hadith transmitters in both Sunni and Shi'i Islam are very, very well documented. And then also women as teachers and really as transmitters of expert knowledge is also quite well documented for certain periods and certain places such as Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. Now, apart from transmitting the Islamic tradition and teaching hadith sciences, religious authority might comprise a variety of roles, such as functioning as preachers, calling to prayer, leading the prayer, engaging in legal scholarship as jurists, who might even issue fatwas. A great variety of juristic opinions exist on whether and under what conditions women may exercise these roles, and their justifications sometimes differ sharply, even within given schools of jurisprudence, the madhahib. Most Sunni and Shi'i madhahib prohibit women from issuing the call to prayer or delivering the khutbah. And one apocryphal exception here is Fatima, about whom we will also speak in a moment. They also prohibit women from leading men or mixed crowds in prayer, although there are minority schools that do permit it. Where women pray collectively, so women-only prayers, the majority opinions in all schools suggest that women should lead such a prayer. By contrast, most Sunni and Shi'i schools of jurisprudence recognize the eligibility of women to serve as muftis, which is very interesting. And not only in issues pertaining or being of particular interest to women, but really in all realms of law a believer might seek advice on. So in the realm of issuing iftar, being a mufti, there are really no restrictions in most schools of jurisprudence, and not including the Imami schools, where women are allowed to provide advice, not only to women, but really to any believer, and also not only on issues that are perhaps closer to women's natural knowledge, but again, on any issue that Islamic law might be relevant to. Nevertheless, 3 of the 4 dominant Sunni madhahib and most Shia schools reject the possibility that women could serve as judges or be qadis. Most do so on the grounds that women are inferior to men in their ability to reason, while others reject it on sociological grounds. One of the chapters in the volume, the one authored by Robert Gleaves, addresses exactly this question. Are women allowed to serve as judges in the Twelver Shi'i school? Among Twelver Shi'i jurists, there are a variety of opinions. The majority opinion is that they are not, but there are also exceptional opinions. Now, they reject this mostly on sociological grounds. The activity of judging would require women to act with men that are haram to them, and such a situation is, of course, to be avoided. Virtually all schools put the burden of proof on the position that women can serve as judges, assuming that they cannot. As Rosvita Badri observes, the fact that women of the first and second generation did generate independent judgments, and of course, examples abound, the wives of the Prophet, the daughter of the Prophet, who were asked to render independent judgment. Nevertheless, despite the fact that this tradition is widely known, it was apparently quickly forgotten or ignored later. Imami jurists in general hold the position that female judgeship is prohibited. And let me just go here to arguments that are among the minority. The requirement of male gender is more often assumed implicitly than explicitly stated. Abdullah Javadi Amuli notes that although Sheikh Mufid in his book Al-Mughniya lays out as the precondition for judgeship only aql, intellect, and in-depth knowledge of Quran and Sunnah, of course, it is clear from his other works that women are considered unfit to serve as judges. And that is the majority opinion among Twelver Shi'i jurists until today. Sheikh Al-Tusi, who died in 1067 Common Era, in his book Al-Nihaya, affirms similar qualities along with taqwa, to be God-fearing, while not specifying the gender of the judge. Yet elsewhere he establishes that women ought not speak publicly, which renders them unfit for the profession. Muhammad ibn Ahmed ibn Idris, who died 1202 Common Era, a descendant of Al-Tusi's daughter, who was a religious scholar herself, in his book Al-Sara'ir suggests that women cannot serve in a public courtroom as one must abstain from all things haram. Indeed, most Imami jurists tend to reject female judgeship not because women are intellectually in or less capable of being judges, but because it would put them in an inappropriate position with regard to men. The reservation most often expressed is hence of sociological nature rather than assuming mental inferiority. So it's not that they have insufficient aql. However, there are voices as early as the 17th century that dissent from this consensus. A group of 12 Shi'i mujtahids advocated permitting women to serve as judges as long as the witnesses were trustworthy. To these belonged Muqaddas Ardabili, who died in 1585, and Sheikh Bahai, who died in 1621. The first proposes that women who have acquired the necessary training in deriving independent reasoning, ijtihad, are capable of becoming judges in matters pertaining to women, provided that they are just and satisfy the other agreed requirements. There's a quote from him: "There's no prohibition on a woman judging on the basis of women's testimony. For example, hearing two women's testimony as long as she conforms to the characteristics that are required in a judge." In the past 150 years, a number of Shi'i scholars have written or issued fatwas on the question of female judgeship. Ayatollah Hussein Nouri Hamadani regards women's judgeship as admissible only within the framework of family arbitration. Javadi Amuli is of the opinion that women cannot become judges if one finds definite ijma establishing the inadmissibility to the profession. And of course, one does find this ijma. But there are a few contemporary examples, such as Ayatollah Yusuf Unal, born in 1937, and Bujnurdi, born in 1945, who see no difference in the role of male or female judges. In the opinion of Unal, those well-versed in judicial precedents and who are endowed with justice and other requirements can attain the permit for judges. Both Urf and Aql do not distinguish between the role of female and male judges. Bujnurdi's opinion is that women can be judges and there's no limitation in this regard in Islam. The measure of judgeship is justice and not gender. All hadith regarding the inability of women to be judges, both in terms of their reasoning and sources, are weak. In short, maleness is not one of the conditions of judgeship. And for the same reasons, following the same argumentation, both also argue that women therefore can become maraja, sources of emulation, which are the highest religious authorities in the 12 Shi'i tradition. So can women become a marja? According to these contemporary scholars, yes, they can. And there are, of course, many more in Iran, but these are the two most high-ranking ones who hold these opinions. Now, let me briefly speak about Nosrat Amin, who is the most outstanding 20th century female mujtahida, and who really has influenced, I think, the landscape of religious authority like no other woman in the 20th century, because she is not only known for authoring this tafsir that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, but she's also authored numerous other works. Of course, she first had to establish herself with works in Arabic that were of Islamic legal nature. Her first published work was a collection of legal rules and commentaries written on 40 hadith. It's called Al-Arba'in al-Hashimiyya, published in 1936, and a compilation of responses to questions on fiqh that were posed to her by contemporary scholars of the Hausa, of the religious seminaries, both in Iran and Iraq. Now, her most known work today is, of course, her Principles of Tafsir in 15 volumes, of which the first appeared in 1956, but she also translated important works such as Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Miskawai's Tahdhib al-Akhlaq, the refinement of character, from Arabic into Persian. And this was actually the text, her translation was the text used in moral philosophy in many universities and religious seminaries in Iran until the turn of the 20th century, when a new translation was published. But it was her translation that was used in the Islamic studies programs for several decades. Now, Amin made a great impact on women's religious education, not only by her example of authoring and publishing these works, which really only became known, I think, to a wider but still very specialist audience in the 1960s and 70s. And I should mention that even Grand Ayatollah Boroujerdi, the most outstanding religious authority in Iran prior to the revolution, had considered Amin on par with the most important Shi'i jurisprudence of his time. He's quoted as having certified that. And her authority was also documented by the fact that she issued ijazas to a number of outstanding male religious scholars of the time, including Ayatollah Marashi Najafi, whose outstanding library is one of the most comprehensive and extensive today in Rome, in the clerical center of Iran. But she's not only known for her published works, but also because she was somewhat a pioneer in religious education. And this was at a time when the Shah's policy, the Shah of Iran, had introduced widespread primary and secondary education that was, of course, compulsory, that was followed mostly secularized curricula, and that was co-educational. In that environment, she actually opened a religious seminary for girls only, and she had to receive all the permissions that this required. It's quite a bureaucratic, laborious process that is nicely documented in this PhD dissertation by Mirjam Künkler. But she justified it very well. It was quite difficult to receive the permissions to open a school just for women and a religious school on top of all in the 1960s in Iran, but she justified it very well, and of course also had to seek alliances across the city of Isfahan in order to assure that these permissions would come through. But she opened an all-girls Islamic high school, the Dabiristan Fatima Amin, as well as an introductory Islamic study seminary called Maktab Fatima, which provided a unique opportunity for women to complete the first 2 of 3 cycles of the Hausa education. There were traditionally, until the 1990s, 3 cycles: the Muqaddimat cycle, the introductory cycle, then comes the Sutu cycle, and then the Dars Kharaj, which will lead someone to then aspire to become a Hujjatul Islam. And it was quite unheard of that women would do even the second cycle of this very specialized Hausa education. And her seminary provided that. And only after she had founded the seminary did the exclusively male seminaries in Rome then also open women's wings. That happened in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But she was really the pioneer. I think they began to think about opening women's wings in order to not leave the field alone to her, if you will. Now, she died 4 years into the revolution at the age of 97. And as I mentioned, now you also see that a number of sort of MA theses are being written in Iran that are concerned with her. But for a long time, her role was, I would say, rather used by the Islamic Republic to highlight her as an example of the pious woman without wishing to create circumstances where anybody would really look into her scholarly works and try to analyze them and analyze how forward-looking in many ways she was. So that is a trend that has only begun rather recently. Her name was known, but it was usually because one wanted to present her as a woman to be followed as an example of piety and not as an outstanding scholar. Now, let me, these are the things that I just mentioned about the seminaries that she had opened. Let me turn to the volume and provide you an overview of these chapters. I won't talk, I will skip here over chapter 2, which is a chapter where I look into these examples of outstanding women religious teachers, hadith transmitters, and then turn in particular to women in the Safavid, Qajar, and Pahlavi dynasties who were influential in generating or forming Islamic religious knowledge, the passing on of religious knowledge. Let me move directly to the chapter of Yasmin Amin, who wrote on Salama, a female authority legitimating the authorities. In this chapter, Yasmin Amin of the University of Exeter examines the figure of Salama, who was one of the Prophet's wives, who is lauded in the Shi'i tradition for her devotion to the Ahl al-Bayt, the Prophet's descendants. She plays a key role in establishing the legitimate succession of Ali to the position of leadership of the Muslim community, as well as subsequent successions. Her case is one of many instances in which the women associated with the Ahl al-Bayt play a vital part in preserving the Nas and explicit designation of a successor that guaranteed the proper unfolding of the historical imamate. So in other words, her contribution to certifying the Nas was absolutely foundational, and therefore women were partakers in identifying and justifying the succession. Alisa Gabay of the University of North Carolina discusses Fatima's khutbah or oration, a manifesto of protest against the historical injustice inflicted on her and her descendants by the Caliph Abu Bakr, when he decided not to grant her the right to inherit the oasis of Fadak from her father, the Prophet. The text is likely apocryphal, but nevertheless old, being attributed to the 8th century historian Abu Mikhnaf, and is also preserved in the 9th century anthology Balaghat al-Nisa by Ibn Tabi Tahir Taifour. This text portrays Fatima not only as a staunch defender of the rights of the Ahl al-Bayt, but also as an astute interpreter of Islamic scriptures and law. It is indeed on the basis of this text that Fatima has been held up as a model of female religious authority in subsequent Shi'i tradition. And of course, the justification that women can inherit just as much as the male heirs goes back to the inauguration by Fatima. And she is therefore quite foundational also for this particular interpretation in the branch of inheritance law. Now, Liaquat Takim's contribution, Liaquat Takim of the McMaster University in Canada, his contribution focuses on female companions of the Imams. Ironically, the companions are designated by the technical term rijal, which is literally men, but they also include women, despite the term, who number among the revered figures whose biographical notices are recorded by authors of the 10th and 11th centuries. These female companions serve important roles as witnesses to the historical events connected with the unfolding of the imamate, as actors privy to the Imam's intimate intentions regarding succession, as custodians of the Imam's secret possessions, and especially as transmitters of the Imam's knowledge and therefore bearers of Islamic canonical tradition and embodiments of correct juridical praxis. So these women rijal, if you will, were quite foundational really in laying the groundwork together with the male rijal in developing arguments of justifications in Islamic reasoning, in transmitting knowledge again, and in general in the juridical praxis. Now, Robert Gleave of the University of Exeter discusses the historical debates in the 12er Shi'i legal tradition, and this is what I gave you a glimpse of earlier, over the question of women can serve as judges. While it is agreed by many 12er authorities that women are able to attain the rank of fully qualified jurists and to grant legal opinions, such as issuing a fatwa, the majority opinion has been that even if they reach the level of fully qualified jurist, women may not serve as judges in the courtroom. After examining Shi'i arguments against women's right to serve as judges, Lee finds that though the 12er Shi'i position differs little from that of Sunni jurists, the manner in which they frame their discussion differs considerably. For they are much more reluctant to state outright that women are fundamentally deficient in their intellect, something their Sunni counterparts do quite frequently. And I could also mention here Karen Bauer's article in the Oriental, I think it's a Journal of the Oriental Society, maybe the year 2010, where she lays out this in great detail, how the justifications given between Shi'i and Sunni jurists regarding the question of whether women can serve as judges differs, and that indeed she also finds that Shi'i jurists put the onus on these more sociological arguments. Women cannot be in a courtroom, cannot mingle with men who are haram, while Sunni jurists are more likely to suggest that women are deficient in their aql and therefore cannot serve as jurists. Now, Devin Stewart analyzes the debate of Husniya, a text that was composed in Safavid Iran in the 16th century, but attributed to the 12th century scholar Abu al-Futu al-Razi, who is best known for his Persian commentary on the Quran, Rad al-Jinan Varav al-Janan. The text, a clever adaptation from the story of the slave girl Tabadud in 1001 Nights, portrays a debate between Husniya, who worked as a servant in the house of Jafar al-Sadiq, and became very learned through the instruction of the Imam, and the leading Sunni scholars on the other side, whom she's debating against, during the time of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Her resounding victory shows that even a slave woman could be imagined as taking on the role of expert theologian and jurist, proving the truth and superiority of Shi'i doctrine against Sunni opponents. And one might add, of course, it's also very interesting that she was not an Arab and she was a slave girl. And so that she was able to, or anyway, that rather, let's say that she was portrayed as winning over the argument is therefore even more extraordinary. Now, Michael Barry's chapter actually deals with this illustration, which is also on the cover of the volume, which is an excerpt from a 16th century painting by the Safavid master painter Muhammad of Herat. And I had written to a number of colleagues in art history while we were putting the book together, asking, are you aware of any representations of women as religious authorities? And a number of colleagues wrote back and said, no, actually, really nothing comes to mind at all, until I asked Michael Barry. And he presented this excerpt from Muhammadi of Herat, inspired by the works of Behzad, another great Persian painter of the Safavid dynasty, who rose to fame at the Timurid capital of Herat and went on to set the foundations of the artistic traditions for the Safavid court. Muhammadi produced this seated princess in about 1565, probably for the Safavid prince Ibrahim, who was then the ruler of Khorasan. Michael Barry argues that Layli, who is presented here, the princess in Muhammadi's painting, and the beloved of Majnun, Layli Majnun, many of you may be familiar with the epic, is portrayed here as the queen of heaven, a manifestation of the divine, in keeping with Ibn Arabi's theology of the feminine nature of God's essence. Barry suggests that this is one of the rare examples in Islamic art in which a woman is portrayed as a figure possessing religious authority. And there's particular significance in the lilies she holds in her hands, because he argues that the lilies are often assumed to reflect or sort of the eyes through which the holder looks at them, and are an opening to God. So when one sort of reflects on oneself as a representation of God through these lilies, and he lays out in the chapter sort of the particular details in the painting which lead him to suggest that one could see her here as a representation of religious authority. Now, the next chapter is written by Yusuf Unal, who examines works dedicated to princesses of the Safavid dynasty, finding that the authors and translators of these works regularly portrayed the princesses as religious and temporal authorities, supplementing their being cast, those who were unmarried in any case, as brides of the 12th Imam in other contexts, connecting their own authority with that of the Imam of the age. So princesses being portrayed as both religious and temporal authorities and as brides of the 12th Imam, while also allowing them to maintain autonomy, being free of obligations to an ordinary husband that their peers did not enjoy. The writers repeatedly style the princesses as modern incarnations of Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and furthermore granted them titles such as Murawij al-Madhab, propagator of the sect, which ordinarily were reserved for the Safavid kings. These perhaps surprising titles and epithets, which cannot be dismissed as frivolous hyperbole, point to them as participants in the divinely sanctioned sovereignty accorded to the Shahs. Now, the next chapter is the one that I had mentioned earlier, where Ruja Fazaili and I compare or present Nosrat Amin, but also Zohreh Sefati, who was born in 1948, probably the most high-ranking contemporary female religious authority, and the one who is, or was at least in the 1990s, also sometimes invoked by the Iranian parliament in Islamic legal reform. So, for example, with regard to the marriage age, her works were being consulted, and an argument was made with reference to her work to change the marriage age. Interestingly enough, the reformists who were in power at the time had wanted to raise the marriage age to 16 and 18, and was 9 and 11 at that time. She has rather conservative opinions, and with reference to her work, then it was the marriage age was raised to 13 and 15. So not as high as the reformists wanted, but still it was raised compared to the previous situation. Now, the next chapter I would say is very interesting to read, because in that chapter, Raffaele Mauriello, who is a scholar of Islamic studies working in Iran, discusses the figure of Amina Bint al-Huda, the sister of the Iraqi scholar Mohammed Bakr al-Sadr, who was executed along with her brother by Saddam Hussein in 1980. Amina was not only a religious teacher. There have been a number of works that look at her really as a social movement leader, as someone who led women, single women in particular, on the Hajj, who organized a number of movements, who advised women on how to become economically independent. So a number of works have really looked at her in the social movement role. You can also say maybe as a social worker. But this chapter looks at her as a religious teacher and as someone who was perceived by his followers, by her brother's followers, as a representative of him, so as a wakil. Amina was not only a religious teacher and author on Islamic topics. Mauriello makes the provocative argument that besides becoming Iraq's leading female social movement leader in the 20th century, Bint al-Huda functioned de facto as a wakil, an agent of her brother's aspiring marjaya. Her brother was destined to become a great marja of Iraqi Shi'i communities or Shi'i communities generally. And she was representing him and his opinions to believers who inquired. She would also collect homes for him at times. She would be perceived as a representative of his bait. Her learning and her choice of career path, along with her decision not to marry, made it possible for her to work closely with her brother in a capacity generally reserved for male authority figures. Now, in the next chapter, Edith Santo examines the case of female teachers in a contemporary women's seminary in Syria. And she was one, or she did her field research there in the last couple of months, really before the war broke out in Syria. So it's very precious work. Ethnographic field research in a women's seminary in the shrine town of Saida Zainab. Edith Santo is an anthropologist. Saida Zainab being located about 15 kilometers south of Damascus. Having conducted ethnographic research at the Zainabiyya, a Shi'i religious educational institution dedicated to the teaching of women that was founded in 1973 by the Iraqi scholar Said Hassan Shirazi, Santo asked what determines whether the path of becoming a teacher is in one of the seminaries was available to women or not. Her study shows an important distinction between women teachers, termed alimat, and women religious performers, termed mulayat. The former have significant potential to act as scholarly authorities, while the latter do not. Her analysis of education and behavior in the Zainabiyya suggests that women's capacity to act as effective religious authorities hinges on their embodiment of aql kamil, so not just aql, but aql kamil, perfect reason, or fully developed rational capacity, which entails not just rational or scholastic understanding, but also sensitivity, practicality, and ethics. So aql kamil also has a number of social faculties that accompany the intellect. Against the background of this particular understanding of reason, female religious authority must be traditional and charismatic, and is restricted. So traditional, charismatic, Weberian categories, traditional in terms of the family background and the educational background, but charismatic also in terms of personality, and is restricted to female members of scholarly families who do not challenge male authority, because their relationship with male authorities is itself taken as evidence of their general qualifications. That is a difference to the work that Ruja Fazaeli and I did in Iran, where we did find women who were also accepted if they did challenge male authority, or if they challenged anyway their colleagues in their opinions, which is of course really a general characteristics of the Iranian seminaries, where debate and deep disagreement in a way is cultivated, and women's religious knowledge there and debate culture was really not different in Iran as we found it from male scholarly debating culture. Now, I will just briefly say that Mariam Rutner's chapter looks at the curricula of two religious seminaries in the south of Iran, which is very interesting because the state in the 1990s started to standardize and unify the curricula, and she actually finds quite a lot of difference with the standard curricula still. And she also conducted interviews with women wondering why they had chosen this path, and she documents interesting differences between Shiraz and Istahban. So one is in a more urban center, one is in a more rural center. But let me come to the comparative observations. Now, let's formulate some tentative conclusions, as Devin, Stewart, and I try in the volume. It appears that, at least judging from what we know at present, women's participation in religious authority as jurists has been significantly more important in the 12 Shi'i tradition, particularly in modern history and especially in Iran, than it has in Sunni societies. While their participation in the transmission of hadith during the medieval period was significantly less substantial than that of their Sunni counterparts. Here we are. The main reason for this difference has to do with relative differences between 12 Shi'i and Sunni Islam with regard to the cultivation of the various religious sciences. For many centuries in the medieval period, the study of hadith was relatively ignored in 12 Shi'i circles, and scholars focused on the study of law per se, making do with consultation of the canonical Shi'i works of the Akhbar as source material. Interest in the focused study of hadith was only revived in the 16th and 17th centuries. In contrast, the study of hadith was highly developed in many Sunni societies in the medieval and early modern periods, and even came to have a substantial social presence in public performances and dictation sessions, the likes of which are unknown in Shi'i contexts. The social capital associated with the acquisition of hadith expertise in Sunni societies was not matched by equivalent concerns in Shi'i societies. So you have a greater involvement of, or documented involvement of women in the transmission of hadith in Sunni societies, but you have a greater involvement of women documented in interpreting the law and maybe developing the law in Shi'i societies. The Shi'i tradition of legal study has shown remarkable strength and continuity over time and has maintained a social role and presence that surpasses those of its Sunni counterparts, particularly from the 19th century to the present day, and especially in Iran. The 12 Shi'i legal system of education has survived into modern times more intact than it has in Sunni environments, and has by and large been spared the ravages wreaked by the confiscation of endowment properties by the modern nation states of the Sunni Islamic world, mainly because the Shi'i institutions depended more on alms funds than on endowments. So in the Ottoman Empire, as many of you will know, religious endowments were incorporated into the state, and which led to the either complete dissolution of institutions of religious learning or incorporation into the state with state-sanctioned curricula that was much less possible in Shi'i majority contexts, where religious institutions were dependent on alms, on religious givings by the believers, which survived in many ways the encroachment of the state into these educational environments. And that is the case until today in Iran and in Iraq, again, one could say after 2003 as well. It is reasonable to argue that the importance of the figure of Fatima in Shi'i tradition sets the stage for an enhanced emphasis on female religious authority. This is not surprising, given the evidence that the role of Fatima has had specific effects on the Shi'i law of inheritance, so that a sole surviving daughter will inherit all of her father's wealth, whereas according to Sunni inheritance law, she will inherit only half. Although Sunni religious tradition also accords a place to revered women of the early Muslim communities, such as Aisha, the Prophet's youngest and most influential wife, the legacy of Fatima is somewhat different because of her intimate connection with the legitimacy of the historical imamate. It is through Fatima that the bloodline between the Prophet and the later Shi'i Imams is established, and it is for this reason that Shi'i traditions portray her as the one who transmits the Muhammadan light to them. Characteristically, her traditions and commentary on the Quran are considered to embody an authority comparable to that of the Imams. The issue of Fadak is not merely about Fatima's rights as a daughter of the Prophet, but about the position of the Ahl al-Bayt in the Muslim community after the Prophet's passing, as well as the injustice of those members of the community who opposed and mistreated them. This pattern continued with other women descendants of the Prophet who played key roles in the succession of the Imams upon the demise of their predecessors. It may be argued that these revered women provided a salient model of religious authority for Shi'i women in general. Of course, one should not exaggerate the social effects of this emphasis on women in the Shi'i tradition, for it was usually not so powerful that it overcame the social restrictions on women in Shi'i societies that limited their access to education and positions of power. But nevertheless, the legacy of Fatima, Zainab, and other women made their stories available to the Shi'i public such that their examples could be invoked under the right circumstances and serve as inspirations on women of later generations. Now, I know I should come to a close, so I will just summarize what I would have still said otherwise. It's very interesting, of course, that Iran in a way presents I think, an example or maybe an environment in itself. And I would still hold on to this. It seemed to me 10 years ago that women are particularly prevalent as sources of religious learning, really, at least from the 1700s onwards, which is unsurpassed, or is not, one finds not comparable extent of women's presence in other environments. And what we write in the introduction is that we wonder whether it may be related to the Mongol invasion, which permeated Iranian society with greater intensity than other Shi'i environments and other Sunni environments, in particular in the Middle East. One finds, for example, that in the works of religious teaching that Jonathan Berkey and Irene Schneider have written about, that women usually would teach from behind a curtain or would be spatially segregated from their students. But in the Iranian environment, there are examples already from the 1300s and 1400s where it is said that the teacher, the woman, bowed down and showed something to the male student in a book. And it suggests that they actually sat side by side. And it's also suggested that they are sitting in a circle. The woman is obviously not behind a curtain if she can bow down and show the male student something that is written in the manuscript. But again, this is just a thesis that we have. We are wondering, and much more research is required to hypothesize what might explain these very different sociological environments in the Iranian context. Then I would just say something with regard to future research. One issue, of course, is the problem of sources. And there's a question whether, in particular, with regard to sort of hadith transmission, there's really much left that can be done to fill holes in our knowledge. So Devin, Stewart, Asma Saeed have already done very considerable work, Leah Katakim in this regard. But I would say that it's particularly for modern times, there are a number of women in clerical families who have not been looked into. The mother of the Grand Ayatollah Burujerdi in Iran actually was a mujtahid in her own right. And there are a number of names. I want to just put them up in case anybody in the audience is interested in thinking about dissertation topics. If you are able to go to Iran, there are a number of family archives that have not been consulted. There are also oral histories that one could still do. The students of Nosrat Amin have, to the largest extent, not been interviewed. There are some traces to see what some of them have become. Some have opened their own seminaries in rural areas, but there are really only there's very little documentation on these women. And so here are a number that require further research, and some of whom have attained the third cycle of the Hausa education, have become mujtahidas themselves. Finally, what we do not cover in the book are issues of Sufi and poetic authority. Of course, religious authority can also be projected through poetry. And in terms of Sufi authority, we do not cover that at all. There are very large blank spots, I would say, in research in Twelver Sufism in this regard as well. I once tried to invite people to present conference papers on women being Sufi leaders, and it was very difficult to find someone who would think there's enough material to write about it. So there are really still a number of blind spots, if one even just looks at Twelver Shi'ism, that one could still cover, and of course in many other parts of this of the Islamic legal tradition, there are even more, I would say. So let me close with these observations, and there are some references that I think I maybe mentioned during the talk. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Künkler. This was really amazing. And one of the things I think your volume does really well, especially since we're also thinking about religious authority in the context of the course at Georgetown, it kind of presents religious authority in a much more expansive fashion than we have been studying thus far in relation to Shi'i Islam. We're thinking about imamat most of the time, but by looking at subsidiary authorities, looking at some of the ways in which women in other domains do exercise religious authority, it could be through curricular writing, right? And so I think from that perspective, this volume has been really generative for our students as well.